So this is going to be kind of our first video lesson for this online learning. And I know I've done some videos before, but it's been maybe for people who were out or when I was out. And so I don't know that everybody's actually watched a video. So what I'm going to try for now is if I'm actually teaching a lesson, I'm going to record the video and post it. And then when we get together on Zoom, when I'm live, I'll be able to answer your questions on material you've already watched. So instead of me trying to teach to you live, because I know sometimes there's distractions, lots of things going on, this way you'll be able to pause the video, rewind it, and then rewatch it again. So that when we get together for our live sessions, it's more of a time where I can answer your questions or work extra problems. Please feel free during this time to email me or message me on Remind, and I will get back to you and make sure that you know what is going on. So what I want to do today, I want to go over some of the problems from the quiz that you took from before spring break. Remember the one you were kind of a little bit anxious about? That's why my Bitmoji is out there to the side, because all of these things are a little bit new, and I know some of you are anxious, but we're going to work through this together. We're going to review those multi-step angle of elevation and depression problems, and I want to kind of see how you feel about that. And then I'm going to post a lesson for law of sine and cosine, and I want you to watch that and work the problems that I post by the next time I see you, so that when we come together in Zoom, you're ready to ask some questions. And then I'll reteach some things there. Okay, so the first thing is that I feel like from the quiz that I need to go back over is the difference between what inverse trig functions are and what reciprocal trig functions are. Because that was a question on your quiz that some of you were a little confused about. So we started this with SOHCAHTOA. So we started with sine, cosine, and tangent. Okay? The reciprocal trig functions are when we take that and flip it over. Remember, reciprocal means that we take our fraction and we flip it over. So if sine is opposite over hypotenuse, adjacent over hypotenuse, and opposite over adjacent, then our reciprocal trig functions are going to be where we take those and we flip them over. And so the reciprocal trig function for sine is cosecant, secant, and cotangent. So cosecant is your hypotenuse over opposite, secant is hypotenuse over adjacent, and cotangent adjacent over opposite. And that's like in your calculator where you have those six, when you hit the trig button and there's those six functions, it goes sine, cosine, tangent, cosecant, secant, cotangent. Okay, that's reciprocal trig functions. Inverse trig functions are what we use when we're looking for an angle measure. So inverse trig function, so this is reciprocal. Inverse is when you're doing like sine -1, cosine -1, tan -1. That's when we're looking for a angle measure, not a side length. So over here when it says if sine theta equals 3/5, what is cotangent theta? So on the first day we did this, I told you to draw a picture of a triangle. Here's your right angle. It doesn't matter which one theta is. So we'll make theta this one. And sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So that means your opposite is 3 and your hypotenuse is 5. Well, cotangent is adjacent over opposite. And if you look at this, and I have my theta right here, I don't have my adjacent. So I have to find that. So on this one, we know it's a 3, 4, 5 triangle. But if you don't know what it is, you do the Pythagorean theorem to get this number right here. And so cotangent theta is equal to adjacent over opposite, and that would be your answer. If it's asking you just what is cosine or what is sine or what is cosecant, you should just be giving me a fraction. If it's actually asking you for an angle measure or a side length, that's when you would put it in your calculator. So the next one says, what is the reciprocal trig function of sine? So the reciprocal trig function of sine is cosecant, because that's what we get when we flip it over. And then the third question on your quiz in that little section was find the cosine of the smaller acute angle in a triangle with side lengths of 10, 24, and 26. Well, the only way you can find the cosine is if it's a right triangle. And we know the hypotenuse has to be 26. It doesn't matter where your 10 and your 24 go, but it says find the cosine of the smaller acute angle. Well, that means it has to be this one because our smaller angle has to be across from our shorter side. So this is now my theta, and I'm looking for cosine theta, which is adjacent over hypotenuse. So you would just write 24 over 26, and you can leave it like that or you can reduce it. Okay, so those were 3 easy questions. I think maybe you just forgot to go back to look at those types of problems for the first day. All right, the next thing I want to talk about was these geometric mean questions. So if you'll remember, when we find geometric mean, we take our 2 numbers, we'll just call them x and y, and we multiply them together, and then we take the square root. So you're going to do the same thing here. These numbers are just a little bit uglier than some of the other ones we've done before. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to multiply this together. When you multiply these fractions together, you multiply the 3 and the 5 and you get 15. The square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is just 2. Over 7 times 7, which is 49. Some of us forgot to multiply the denominators together. We just brought the 7 over. Okay, remember you have to multiply that. So that's going to give me 30 over 49. But the geometric mean says that we take the square root of 30 over 49. Now we're not done here because the denominator, the square root of 30 over 49 is the same thing as the square root of 30 over the square root of 49. And you can't have that radical in the denominator. So to leave it in simplest radical form, you would do the square root of 30 over 7. You would leave it like that. That would be your answer. Okay, for 15, when you multiply 60 times 1/5, 60 times 1/5 is 12. So you're doing the square root of 60 times 1/5, which is the square root of 12. And then when you simplify that, you should get 2 square root of 3. All right, going to the next page. I asked you to use geometric mean to work these problems. Okay, so when I look at this, if you'll remember that if we're using the altitude, so if we're using this number right here, the altitude is equal to the geometric mean of part times part. And so I'm pretty confident at this point I'm going to have to factor. If you have a radical on one side, so on here I have a radical on the right side, I'm going to square both sides. So I'm going to get 144 equals x squared plus 7x. Move that 144 over. And we need to see if we can factor. So in this case, we're going to use x plus 16, x minus 9. So that means that that gives us that x equals negative 16 or positive 9. So we're getting rid of this one. So my x equals 9. So this is 9 and this is 16. So to get y, we're going to say y is equal to the geometric mean of part times whole. Because if you add this together, you would get 25. And so if you multiply 9 times 25 together, you should get 125. So then the square root of 125 is 15. Or you could have done Pythagorean theorem in this triangle to get y. Okay, I feel like that you realized that 20 was your bonus. Remember, this was the quiz where I said, one of these is a bonus, I'm just not telling you which one it is, because 20 is a pretty difficult problem. I'm not going to say it's not. So I want to do 21 first, because 21 is a problem that everybody should have been able to do. So let's do it first, and then we'll go back to 20. All right, so in 21, we're using Pythagorean theorem. So you're going to say x squared plus 2x squared equals 2x plus 3 squared. Now, when you do 2x squared, you have to square that entire, like this entire monomial. So it's x squared plus 4x squared equals. Now, 2x plus 3 is a binomial. So that's where you have to write this down twice and fool it. And so you should have gotten 4x squared plus 12x plus 9 when you fool that out. Now you have a 4x squared on both sides, so those can just go away, which leaves you with x squared minus 12x minus 9 equals 0. And so you were looking for two numbers that multiply to give you 9 and add to give you 12, and you couldn't find those. If you can't find factors, then you either have to complete the square or use quadratic formula. So I'm going to complete the square. Remember, when you complete the square, you take b and you divide it by 2 and square it. So if I say b divided by 2 squared, I'm going to add 36 to both sides. And here is where I factor this. And when you factor it, you just do b divided by 2 in the parentheses. We're going to take the square root of both sides. So that's going to be x minus 6 equals the square root of 45. You're going to move that 6 over. So we're going to get x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 45. The square root of 45 will simplify out. So you're going to get 6 plus or minus 3 square root of 5. Now you need to put that in your calculator, because if you do 6 plus 3 square root of 5 and 6 minus 3 square root of 5, you need to see which one works. Okay, and in this case, the only one that works is plus. So that's your answer. Okay, for 20, we're going to have to use a system. And again, this one is a little bit difficult. So you may have to rewind this or pause it and kind of wrap your mind around some things that are happening with this. So in this problem, your y value is the same thing. We don't know what y is, but we know it's the same in both triangles. And our x value is also the same. So if you set this up, what you could say for this triangle is x squared plus y squared equals 16. You're doing Pythagorean theorem. And then for this triangle, you could say x plus 2 squared plus 4, that being 2 squared here, equals y squared. Now you have y squared in both equations. Okay, so if you have that y squared is in both equations, then you can replace something. Okay, so for example, if I made this y squared equals 16 minus x squared, then I could take that right there and I could plug it in for y so that I would have one variable. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite that on the other side. So I'm going to write x plus 2 squared plus 4 equals, and instead of writing y squared, I'm going to write 16 minus x squared. So I took this equation, but I replaced the y squared with what it equals in our other equation. Okay? Again, for the x plus 2 squared, you're going to have to fool that. So that's going to be x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 16 minus x squared. Okay? Now we need to get everything to the other side. So if I add x squared to the other side, that's going to give me 2x squared plus 4x. Add those together and you get 8, but but you're subtracting the 16 over, so you're going to get minus 8 equals 0. And at this point, you should see that they have a GCF. So you're going to have x squared plus 2x minus 4 equals 0. Okay, so we're going to see if we can factor this. So are there two numbers that can multiply to give you 4 and add to give you 2? If not, you have to complete the square or use quadratic formula. So x squared plus 2x equals 4. Remember, we do b divided by 2 squared. So if I take this and divide it by 2 and square it, that's going to be plus 1 plus 1. So that's going to be x plus 1 squared equals 5. So x equals negative, actually, let me go back a step. This is going to be x plus 1 equals the square root of 5. We're going to take the square root of both sides. So that's going to be x equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 5. Now, x can't equal a negative number. So we're not going to be able to have negative 1 minus the square root of 5. So x is only going to equal negative 1 plus the square root of 5, so that it will be a positive value. Okay? Now at this point, I need to figure out what y equals so I can plug it back in for x so that I can solve for y. Okay? Now, probably the easiest place to do that would be this equation right here. Okay? Because that would be the easiest place to plug it back in. So I'm going to write it at the top. I'm going to erase this and I'm going to write it up here. Okay? So if I take this equation and say y squared equals 16 minus x squared. And so for x, I'm going to plug in this value. Okay? So y squared equals 16 minus negative 1 plus the square root of 5 squared. Negative 1 plus the square root of 5 is a binomial. So in order to square that, you have to write it down twice and FOIL it. So I'm going to say negative 1 plus the square root of 5 times negative 1 plus the square root of 5. And I'm going to FOIL this. So that's going to give me 1 minus the square root of 5 plus the square root of 5 plus 5. Actually, that's going to be minus. Okay? Combine like terms. 1 plus 5 is 6 minus 2 square root of 5. That's going to give me that y squared equals 16 minus 6 minus 2 square root of 5. And we have to distribute that negative. So that's going to be y squared equals 16 minus 6 is 10. But we take that and we have to distribute that negative. So that's going to be plus 2 square root of 5, but that's what y squared equals. So that means we're going to have to take the square root of that to get what y equals. So y equals the square root of 10 plus 2 square root of 5. That's what y would equal. Again, I told you you would know which one the bonus was. So yes, this is a lot, but I think it's a fun problem to kind of play around with. So that would be something to go back and see if you can get my answer. All right, let's go down to these angle of elevation and depression problems. These are ones where you had to draw a picture and then solve. These are not the ones like where you're standing somewhere and then you're moving back. Okay, they do have two different types of two angles, but it's not one where the long problem where you're working before. All right, so an observer on a cliff 1,000 yards above sea level sights two ships due east. The angles of depression of the ships are 47 and 32. All right, so we have this cliff that's 1,000 yards above sea level, and it sights 2 ships due east. So you're going to have a ship. Don't forget how good I am at drawing boats. And the angles of depressions of the ships are 47 and 32. And if you'll remember from before spring break, we talked about the closer you get to something, the higher the angle of elevation gets. Because when you back up from something, the angle of elevation that you have to look up gets smaller. So 47 should be here, and 32 should be here. And we want to find the distance between the 2 ships. So what you're going to do is you're going to use trig to find the distance from here to here, like to find x. And then you're going to use trig to find the distance from like here to here. And I would make that y. And then we would subtract them. Okay? So if I'm using this right here, this is opposite over adjacent. So tan 47 equals opposite over adjacent. And then the other one is going to be tan 32 equals opposite over adjacent. And then you would solve both of those and subtract to find the distance between the 2. Okay? All right, I'm going to go back to my desk and get my calculator. I want you to start drawing a picture for 23. And I'm going to grab my calculator and come right back. All right, so a lake measures 600 feet across. A lodge stands on one shore. So we have like this building over here. From your point on the opposite shore, the angle of elevation to the top of the lodge is 4 degrees. How high above the lake does the lodge stand? So like you have this lake here, and you're standing over here. And remember your angle of elevation, like this is straight out. So your angle of elevation here is 4. And this is 600 feet across. And then how high above the lake does the lodge stand? So you're looking for this. So opposite and adjacent. So tan 4 equals opposite over adjacent. And then when your number is in the denominator, you're going to say 600 times tan 4. And you should have gotten that x equals 41.96. And this should be feet. All right, I'm going to stop this video now, and I'm going to start a new video for the last page just so it's not so long because it won't be hard for you to download. So I'm going to stop this one, and then I'll start up with the next one for the last page.